165 years ago, on July 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass delivered a speech to the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society in Rochester, New York, about what Independence Day meant to him as a black man. It was a great speech in a life filled with great speeches. And to commemorate its anniversary, here are 5 liberating things about Frederick Douglass. Number 1, he stole his own freedom. Midway through his 1852 speech in Rochester, Frederick Douglass asked his audience, "What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us?" He went on to answer that question. "I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. You may rejoice. I must mourn." Douglass liked to remind his white audiences that he didn't owe his freedom to George Washington, the Minutemen, the framers of the Constitution, or anyone else typically memorialized and celebrated on the 4th of July. He often described himself as a thief, explaining, "I stole this head, these limbs, this body from my master and ran off with them." He wasn't given his liberty. He took it for himself. But the most impressive thing about Frederick Douglass wasn't how he gained his freedom, but what he chose to do with it. Number 2, he was a living, breathing rebuke to white supremacy. In the mid-19th century, as today, one of the primary narratives promoted by white supremacists was that black people were inherently primitive, violent, unintelligent, and generally incapable of participating in civilized society as anything other than servants or laborers. But anyone trying to sell that had to reckon with Frederick Douglass. He was one of the most renowned orators of his era, compared by his friend and eventual rival William Lloyd Garrison to Patrick Henry. His words were no less powerful on the page. When he published his first of 3 autobiographies in 1845, some critics insisted it was too eloquent for a black man to have written it. But there was more than his eloquence to distinguish Douglass. There was also his courage. Number 3, he challenged the legacies of white heroes. Douglass was actually less radical than some of his fellow abolitionists, including Garrison, but he managed to stick pins in a few of white folks' favorite balloons nevertheless. For instance, he was never quite comfortable with the notion that Abraham Lincoln had been the great patron saint of black America. He worked with Lincoln, came to regard him as a great man, and spoke glowingly of him after his death. But he also stressed that Lincoln, while a great friend to black Americans, had always been first and foremost a white man's president. He was not so conflicted about another idol of white America. When Robert E. Lee died, Douglass complained of the, quote, nauseating flatteries of Lee, which filled the newspapers, writing, "We feel no remorse at the passing of Robert E. Lee. During the war, he did all he could to destroy the government, and since the war, he has labored to keep alive the embers of sectional discord." Douglass was an enemy of inequality and oppression wherever he found it. That's why he was not only a champion of black liberation. Number 4, he supported women's suffrage. Douglass was the only black attendee of the Seneca Falls Convention. The first event of its kind dedicated to the subject of women's rights, the convention convened on July 19, 1848. Douglass spoke up in favor of a resolution supporting women's suffrage, telling those assembled that denying women the right to vote amounted to the maiming and repudiation of one half of the moral and intellectual power of the government of the world. After the convention, Douglass published an editorial in his newspaper, the North Star, declaring that woman was justly entitled to all we claim for man. But it wasn't just the rights of women. Douglass supported equality and fair treatment for immigrants, Native Americans, and worked to make the United States more truly unified in its diversity. Number 5, he spent his life fighting for inclusion and equality. Though he often pointed out, as in his Independence Day speech in Rochester, that the U.S. Constitution had not been written for him, he believed in its values nonetheless and strived to see those values extended to all Americans. He opposed separatist movements such as Black Zionism, which encouraged Black Americans to return to their ancestral African homelands. He wanted to see Black Americans take their rightful places as citizens in their own country, not become refugees in someone else's. He never shrank from defending his people against the brutalization they endured at the hands of white supremacy, but he also never lost his faith that absolution from America's racist original sin would ultimately come not in the form of separation or segregation, but reconciliation. Hopefully, the day will come when the people of the United States are able to justify that faith. The hardest part is picking only 5. Catch you next time. Hey folks, hope you found that one worthwhile. If you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and also please consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron. Thanks for watching.